I had been at my new cabin for less than 3 minutes when a man in a security jacket told me I was trespassing on my own land. That still sounds ridiculous when I say it out loud, but that is exactly how this whole mess started. I had just driven 4 hours north with everything I thought I needed for the first weekend in the place I had spent months planning for: a stack of sketchbooks on the passenger seat, a cooler in the back, 2 duffel bags, and a kind of optimism I had not felt in a long time. The cabin sat at the end of a gravel lane lined with pines, the kind of quiet stretch where you could hear the breeze moving through branches before you even stepped out of the truck. This was supposed to be my reset. I am Logan Mercer, and until that morning, the hardest part of buying that cabin had been convincing myself I deserved a peaceful life after years of deadlines, traffic, and living in apartments where I could hear strangers arguing through the walls. I work as a wildlife illustrator, which means I spend a lot of time trying to capture calm in places most people only pass through, and I had bought that property because I wanted to finally live inside the kind of landscape I had been drawing for years. I had done everything right. I checked the title history, reviewed the survey, signed the closing documents, wired the money, and saved digital copies of every piece of paperwork in 2 separate folders because I am that kind of person. By the time I turned onto that gravel road, I was not guessing. I knew exactly what I owned. So when I parked in front of my cabin, reached for the door handle, and saw a white SUV roll up behind me, I assumed someone was there to welcome the new owner or maybe remind me about trash pickup. Instead, a tall guy in a dark jacket stepped out, looked at me like I had already caused a problem, and asked what I was doing on the property. I actually laughed at first because I thought there had to be some misunderstanding. I told him I had just bought the cabin. I even pointed to the moving bins in the truck bed like that should settle it. But he did not laugh. He asked for identification, then told me this lot was under community oversight and that I needed to leave until my status was verified. My status? Like I was trying to sneak into a resort instead of unloading groceries onto land I had just paid for. Before I could even process that, another vehicle pulled up, and a woman stepped out with the kind of posture that made it obvious she was used to people stepping aside when she arrived. She did not introduce herself right away. She just looked at me, then at the cabin, then back at me like I was some inconvenience that had appeared on schedule. When she finally spoke, she said, "If you're the one who bought this place, you should know you can't be here until this is sorted out." That was the moment the excitement drained out of me and something colder took its place, because she said it with too much confidence for this to be a simple mix-up, and I remember standing there with my keys in one hand and my closing folder in the other, staring at the front porch of my own cabin while 2 strangers acted like I had no right to set foot on it. For a second, I honestly thought if I just showed them the paperwork, the whole thing would clear up and we would all move on with our day. I opened the folder I kept on the passenger seat, pulled out the closing documents, and handed over the top sheet with my name, the lot number, and the purchase date printed right there in black and white. The guard barely glanced at it before passing it to the woman beside him. She looked at the page for maybe 2 seconds, then handed it back like it was a restaurant receipt she did not need. She told me her name was Diane Keller and said she represented the Homeowners Association. The way she said it made it sound less like a neighborhood committee and more like a private government. Then she told me there were questions about access, boundary use, and compliance, and until those issues were reviewed, I was not authorized to occupy the property. I remember blinking at her because that sentence was so carefully polished and so completely absurd that it took a moment to even register. I said, as calmly as I could, that I had title insurance, county records, a signed deed, and legal possession of the cabin as of the closing date. Diane did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She just gave me a tight smile and said that people who bought in this community sometimes misunderstood what ownership meant here. That was the first moment I felt the situation shift from confusing to insulting. I had spent months getting to this day. I had not stumbled into a scam on a back road with no research. I had walked through every step like an adult making the biggest purchase of his life. The cabin was not some impulsive fantasy. It was the first thing I had chosen entirely for myself in years. For almost a decade, I had built my schedule around client deadlines, commercial projects, and the kind of digital illustration work that paid well enough but left me staring at screens 12 hours a day. Wildlife art was what I cared about, but peace and time had become luxuries. When I found that cabin online, tucked against a stand of pine and maple with a narrow ridge behind it, and enough quiet space to actually hear birds at dawn. It felt less like a property listing and more like a door opening. I called the listing agent 3 separate times. I reviewed the survey maps. I checked the parcel lines through county records. I asked about restrictions, easements, common areas, road access, all of it. Every answer came back clean enough to move forward. So standing there while Diane talked down to me in my own driveway, I was not just frustrated. I was trying to understand what part of this picture had been hidden from me. I looked past her toward the cabin, at the cedar siding catching the morning light, at the porch I had imagined sitting on with coffee and a sketch pad, and I felt this weird split between the life I thought I had just arrived at and the one unfolding in front of me. Then Diane told the guard to make a note that I had been informed of the access issue, and that was when I realized this was not an awkward misunderstanding they were trying to solve. This was a process they had done before, and somehow, I had just stepped straight into it. What made Diane so unsettling was not that she was loud or openly hostile. It was that she acted like the outcome had already been decided before I ever pulled into the driveway. She did not ask questions the way someone asks when they are trying to get information. She asked them the way a person does when they are building a file. She wanted to know when I planned to stay there, whether I intended to make improvements, whether any contractors were coming, whether I had been given community documents at closing. Every answer I gave seemed to satisfy her in the worst possible way, like I was accidentally helping confirm something she already believed. I finally asked her directly what the actual issue was. She said there were ongoing concerns about the status of the lot, the use of adjacent grounds, and community access expectations that prior owners had been aware of. That phrase stuck with me, because it sounded carefully designed to mean something without committing to anything. I told her I had never been informed of any disputed ownership or restricted occupancy. She said that was unfortunate and glanced at the guard like this whole thing was now an administrative inconvenience caused by someone else's failure to educate me. Then she added, almost casually, that several owners had found it easier to work with the association rather than insist on individual interpretations of property rights. That was the first time I felt the edge under her politeness. She was not explaining rules. She was testing whether I would fold. I looked around while she talked and noticed 2 things I had missed at first because I had been too focused on the shock of being challenged. The first was how quiet everything had become. A few neighboring cabins sat scattered through the trees, close enough that someone could have stepped out and seen what was going on, but no one did. It was that specific kind of silence that does not feel natural. It feels observed. The second thing was the signs. There was one near the gravel turnoff about preserving community standards, another near the side trail about shared amenities, and one farther down. Warning that unauthorized use of common space could result in enforcement action. None of that had seemed strange when I first arrived. Plenty of planned communities had signs. But now every one of them felt less like a reminder and more like a warning. Diane kept speaking in that smooth, measured tone, telling me that if I left voluntarily while the matter was reviewed, it would avoid unnecessary complications. I asked how long that review would take. She said that depended on my level of cooperation. That answer told me everything I needed to know. There was no clear process, no timeline, and probably no neutral review waiting in the background. There was only her, the guard, and whatever version of reality they had gotten used to imposing on people. I was tired from the drive, irritated, and more confused than I wanted to admit, but I was not stupid. If I stayed and argued on the porch, I would only give them a story to tell about the difficult new owner. If I left, at least for the moment, I could figure out what they were actually doing. So I loaded the folder back into my truck, told Diane I would be contacting the county and my title company that afternoon, and watched something flicker across her face. It was brief, but I caught it. Not fear exactly, and not surprise either. It was closer to annoyance, like I had failed to follow the script she expected. And as I pulled away from the cabin I had waited months to call home, I had the sinking feeling that I was not dealing with one overbearing neighbor. I was dealing with a system she had built around herself. I drove 10 miles down the mountain before I finally pulled into a gas station parking lot, and just sat there with both hands on the steering wheel, replaying every word Diane had said. The whole thing had the polished surface of a rules issue, but underneath it was pressure, plain and simple. She had not told me what document overrode my deed. She had not pointed to a court order, a county dispute, or anything concrete. She had just wrapped authority around herself and expected me to accept it. I called the title company first, partly because I wanted to hear another human being confirm I was not losing my mind. The woman who answered pulled up my file, verified the parcel number, and told me there were no exceptions in the policy, suggesting an active ownership conflict. I asked her specifically whether a homeowners association could stop a legal owner from accessing his property based on some internal review. She paused for a second, then said, carefully, that associations could enforce covenants, but they could not simply erase recorded ownership because they felt like it. That helped for about 30 seconds. Then I called the county clerk's office, and after being transferred twice, I reached someone who confirmed the deed had been recorded properly that morning. The lot was in my name. Taxes would be in my name. According to the county, there was nothing unclear about who owned that cabin. By then I should have felt relieved, but I did not, because the problem was no longer whether I was right. The problem was that Diane either knew I was right and did not care, or had been operating in her own version of reality long enough that nobody around her challenged it. I got a motel room in the nearest town that night, because I did not want my first move to be an emotional one. I spread the closing packet across the bed, opened my laptop, and started reading every line again. Purchase agreement, title commitment, survey sketch, association disclosures, bylaws, road maintenance agreement, all of it. There were pages of ordinary restrictions about paint colors, noise hours, trash storage, exterior structures, and short-term rentals, the usual things people complain about but can live with. What I did not find was any language giving the association the right to block an owner from occupying a recorded parcel while they sorted out their feelings about it. The more I read, the stranger one detail became. The association map included shaded areas labeled as shared green space and trail access, but the survey attached to my sale documents showed my parcel line running farther than that community map suggested. Not by a little, either. Enough to matter. Enough that a side section of wooded ground behind the cabin might be included in my lot on the county survey, but treated like communal space on whatever version Diane was using. I zoomed in on both documents until the screen blurred and realized for the first time that this might not be about my cabin at all. It might be about the land around it. The next morning, before I even had coffee, I checked my email and found a message from the association. It was a formal notice, sent less than 12 hours after I arrived, stating that my use of the property was under review due to unresolved access and compliance concerns, and that any attempt to occupy or alter the parcel before approval could result in enforcement action and monetary penalties. The speed of it was almost impressive. Diane had gone from roadside warning to official paper trail in a single afternoon, which told me she was not improvising. She was following a pattern, and somehow I had become the next person expected to back down. That email changed the way I looked at everything. Up until then, part of me had still wanted to believe Diane was just one of those overbearing people who had gotten too comfortable talking to others like she ran the place. But a formal notice sent that fast meant there was infrastructure behind her. Templates, procedures, language designed to sound official enough to intimidate someone before they had time to think. I stopped trying to talk myself into patience and started treating the whole situation like a research project, because that is what I know how to do when something does not make sense. I called the county survey office as soon as they opened and asked whether someone could walk me through the parcel map line by line. The woman there was patient, sharp, and refreshingly direct. She pulled up the lot number, compared it to the subdivision plat, and confirmed that the recorded parcel included not just the footprint of the cabin and driveway, but a strip of wooded land running behind it toward a narrow ridge trail. When I asked whether that section had ever been transferred to a community easement or common area, she said she saw no such filing in the public record. Then I mentioned the association map showing a shared access zone overlapping part of that area, and she gave the kind of pause people give when they're trying to remain professional. Finally, she said that internal association maps did not override recorded county plats unless there had been a properly filed amendment or easement. In other words, if Diane wanted that land to function like common space, she needed more than a shaded box on a neighborhood diagram. She needed law on her side, and from what the county could see, she did not have it. I spent the next few hours digging through every attachment in the association documents I had received before closing. Buried in the back of one PDF was a faded site plan that looked like it had been revised several times over the years. Some labels were crisp, some were not, and one corner had a notation about proposed trail connectivity that never seemed to have been finalized. Proposed. That word mattered. The more I compared the plans, the more it looked like someone in the association had started treating an idea as if it were settled fact. But there was another possibility I could not ignore. Maybe it had started as a mistake years ago, and after nobody pushed back, the mistake had hardened into policy. Around noon, I called the listing agent who handled my purchase. He sounded uneasy the second I explained what happened. He said the seller had not disclosed any active dispute and that, to his knowledge, the lot was conveyed as shown on the survey. When I asked whether prior access issues had ever come up, he hesitated long enough for me to notice. Then he said there had once been vague talk about the association wanting clearer trail rules near the rear lots, but nothing he had understood as an ownership conflict. Vague talk. That was exactly the kind of phrase people use when they know something was odd, but did not want to touch it too closely. By late afternoon, I had a folder on my laptop with screenshots, county map exports, scanned disclosures, timestamps, and the formal notice from the association saved in 3 different places. I was building a timeline now, not because I enjoyed it, but because I could feel the shape of the problem changing. This was not about whether I belonged there. It was about whether Diane had been allowed to blur the line between community preference and legal authority for so long that she no longer cared where one ended and the other began. And if that was true, I had a feeling I was not the first person she had tried it on. The first real break in the story came from someone I did not expect to hear from at all. Late that evening, after I had spent most of the day collecting documents and making calls, I received an email from a woman named Marjorie Bell. I did not know her name, but her message was short, careful, and impossible to ignore. She said she lived in the community part-time, had seen me arrive the day before, and believed I might want to know that I was not the first owner to be pressured over land use near the backlots. She did not go into detail in writing. She just asked if I would be available for coffee the next morning in town, somewhere away from the neighborhood. That phrase alone told me more than she probably intended. Somewhere away from the neighborhood. As if speaking honestly inside the community came with consequences. I met her at a small diner off the highway just after 8. She was probably in her late 60s, neatly dressed, composed, and the kind of person who looked like she had spent years choosing her words carefully. She told me she had owned a cabin there for almost 12 years and had watched Diane Keller steadily expand her influence, well beyond what most people imagined an association president should have. Marjorie said Diane was not officially in charge of everything, but in practice she controlled the board agenda, the security contractor, and most communication with owners. According to her, the pattern was always the same. New people arrived excited, not wanting conflict. Diane greeted them with warnings, policy language, and suggestions that some issue needed to be reviewed. If the owner pushed back, the pressure increased. Letters, fines, gate access problems, complaints about contractors, mysterious references to community expectations. Some people fought. Most did not. I asked whether anyone had ever challenged her with legal documents. Marjorie gave me a look that was both sympathetic and tired. She said one couple had, a few years back, after being told they could not build a deck where their survey clearly showed they had room. The dispute dragged on long enough that they eventually sold the place. Another owner had argued over trail access running near his lot line and suddenly found himself under constant scrutiny for minor rule violations. He sold too. That was when the shape of the whole thing came into focus for me. Diane did not need to win on the law if she could make ownership exhausting enough that people decided peace was worth more than principle. Then Marjorie mentioned something that made every document on my laptop matter even more. She said the wooded strip behind my cabin had been discussed for years as the ideal route for a scenic connector trail that would link 2 sections of the community without forcing hikers onto the road. The problem was that the route crossed land the association never actually secured. Instead of negotiating a proper easement, they had apparently behaved as if eventual access was close enough to ownership. I asked if she was sure. She nodded and said she had seen old meeting packets with trail sketches and language about long-term access goals. Goals. Plans. Preferred use. None of that was a deed. None of that gave Diane the right to decide I was trespassing. Before we left, Marjorie lowered her voice and told me one more thing. The previous owner of my cabin had spent less and less time there over the last 2 years after repeated friction with the association over the rear property line. He never openly accused anyone of misconduct, but according to Marjorie, he had become tired of feeling watched every time he set foot near the back of his own lot. I drove away from that diner with a fresh wave of anger, because now I understood the real strategy. This was not about confusion. It was about wearing people down until the association got the version of the land it wanted. Once I understood that Diane's real advantage was pressure, not proof, I stopped reacting and started documenting. I hired a local real estate attorney named Claire Donnelly, sent her every file I had collected, and asked one simple question. If the county records, survey, and deed all matched, what exactly could the association lawfully do to me? Her answer was calm, but it carried the weight I needed. They could enforce recorded covenants. They could not invent ownership limits or block access to my parcel without a legal basis. She told me to keep every email, save every notice, avoid emotional exchanges, and if I returned to the property, make sure everything was time-stamped. So that is what I did. I bought 2 exterior cameras, a dashboard camera for my truck, and a cloud storage plan I had never expected to need for a cabin in the woods. When I drove back up 2 days later, I did it with printed copies of my deed, the county plat, and Claire's business card in the console beside me. The minute I turned onto the gravel road, I could feel the difference in myself. I was still angry, but I was no longer uncertain. I parked in the driveway, stepped out, and began unloading a few basic supplies because I wanted a record of ordinary, lawful use of my own property. I had been there maybe 15 minutes when the same security SUV appeared at the end of the drive. The guard got out with a clipboard this time, which would have been funny if the whole situation had not been so absurd. He informed me that the association had not approved occupancy and that my presence was being noted as a compliance violation. I asked him which recorded covenant allowed them to suspend occupancy of a deeded parcel. He said he was not there to debate policy. I said that was fine, because I was not debating. I was asking him to identify the rule he believed overrode county ownership records. He had no answer. He just repeated that he was documenting the encounter. That was when I realized something important. Their whole system depended on sounding official until somebody asked for specifics. Later that afternoon, I received another email from Diane, more polished than the last one and somehow more revealing. She stated that my continued presence on the lot could interfere with established community access expectations and ongoing review of rear boundary use. Established community access. Expectations. Not easement. Not recorded right-of-way. Expectations. She was still dressing preference in legal clothing and hoping it would pass. I forwarded the email to Claire, who replied within an hour and said the phrasing was useful because it suggested they knew this was about use, not title. The pressure escalated the next day. A delivery driver bringing a small folding table and boxed kitchen supplies called me from the road to say security had told him the address was under restriction and he should not proceed without clearance. Then the gate code I had been given in my closing packet suddenly stopped working. I had to wait while another resident exited so I could get back in. Every piece of it was small enough to sound petty if described one by one, but together it formed a pattern so clear I could almost admire the design of it. They were trying to make simple ownership feel like trespassing by 1,000 inconveniences. But by then, every notice, every blocked delivery, every evasive phrase was becoming evidence. And for the first time since I bought the cabin, I had the distinct sense that Diane was building a case she thought would scare me away while I was quietly building the one that could expose exactly what she had been doing. The turning point came faster than I expected, and it happened because Diane finally pushed the whole thing into a room where other people had to hear it. Claire sent a formal response to the association disputing every claim that suggested they could restrict my lawful access, and within 2 days the board scheduled what they called a special compliance review. That phrase sounded official enough, but when Claire explained it to me, the reality was simpler. Diane wanted a controlled setting where she could present me as a difficult new owner refusing to respect community rules. What she did not know was that Claire had already assembled a clean, chronological package of everything they had sent, blocked, implied, and contradicted. The meeting took place in a modest clubhouse near the front entrance, a low building with stone veneer and a conference room that looked like it had hosted 100 awkward budget discussions. When I walked in, I saw 6 folding chairs lined along one wall, 3 board members at a long table, the security contractor near the back, and Diane seated slightly forward, as if she were not technically in charge but expected everyone to treat her that way. A few residents had also shown up, and judging by the way they avoided eye contact at first, word had spread. Diane opened with a polished summary that made me sound like a man who had ignored repeated guidance about disputed rear access and possible common use restrictions. She described my actions as confrontational, my return to the property as premature, and my concerns as misunderstandings about how the community functioned. If I had not lived through it myself, I almost might have admired how confidently she bent the facts. Then Claire stood up. She did not match Diane's tone. She did not need to. She simply walked the board through the documents one by one. First, the recorded deed showing title in my name. Then the county plat confirming the parcel boundaries. Then written confirmation from the survey office stating there was no filed easement granting the association rights over the disputed strip. Then the notices Diane had sent using phrases like community access expectations and ongoing review without citing a single recorded restriction authorizing them to bar me from my own property. You could feel the room changing as each page landed on the table. One of the board members leaned forward and began reading more carefully. Another asked Diane whether there was in fact any filed easement she had not yet produced. She said the community had long understood the rear area as functionally shared. Claire replied that functionally shared was not a legal category recognized by the county. Then came the part that really broke it open. Claire played a short clip from my dashboard camera showing the guard telling me I could not remain on the parcel while I held my closing documents in hand. Not threatening, not shouting, just the plain absurdity of a legal owner being treated like an intruder. After that, the board's questions changed direction completely. They stopped asking me to explain myself and started asking Diane why formal notices had been issued without supporting authority. The security contractor looked deeply uncomfortable. A resident near the wall quietly said this was not the first time rear lot lines had been handled this way. Then another person spoke up, and then another. By the time the meeting ended, the story Diane had been managing for years was no longer hers to control. The board announced they were suspending all enforcement related to my lot pending outside legal review, and as people filed out of the room, I caught the first expression on Diane's face that had not looked rehearsed since the day we met. It was not outrage. It was the look of someone realizing that documents, once read aloud in the right order, can undo an entire structure of intimidation. The final unraveling took about 3 weeks, which in normal life is not very long, but after the way this began, it felt like watching an entire season break at once. Once the board froze enforcement on my lot, outside counsel reviewed the association records, the county filings, and the notices Diane had authorized. The conclusion, when it came, was almost embarrassingly clear. There was no recorded easement over the rear strip of my property, no lawful basis for restricting my occupancy, and no authority for security to warn me off my own land. The board issued a written notice withdrawing every compliance claim tied to that supposed access dispute, confirming that my parcel was to be treated according to the county plat and recorded deed, and directing management to stop interfering with deliveries, gate access, or ordinary use. Claire told me to save that letter in 4 places, which I did. Not because I expected another surprise, but because I had learned very quickly how fragile peace can be when someone gets used to power without accountability. Diane resigned from her role on the board before the month was over. Officially, it was for personal reasons. Unofficially, it happened right after residents began asking harder questions about prior enforcement actions, old trail proposals, and whether other owners had been pressured using the same language she used on me. I never got the dramatic public apology people like to imagine in stories like this. There was no speech, no tearful admission, no scene where everyone suddenly became honest and brave. What happened instead was quieter and, in some ways, more satisfying. People started talking. Marjorie emailed me again to say several owners had begun comparing old letters and notices. One couple found correspondence that suggested they had been steered away from using part of their lot without any real legal basis. Another resident said he had stopped contesting minor fines years earlier because he assumed fighting would be useless. Once the fear of being the only person speaking up disappeared, the pattern became visible to everyone. As for me, I finally got to do the ordinary things I had planned from the beginning. I carried my boxes inside without anyone following me in a security truck. I unpacked the kitchen, set up my folding table near the front window, and took my sketchbooks out to the porch in the late afternoon when the light turned gold through the pines. The first morning I woke up there for real, I opened the back door just after sunrise and stood in that narrow strip of wooded ground that had caused all this trouble. It was quiet in the way I had imagined months earlier, but it felt different now. Not softer, more earned. I walked the rear line with a copy of the survey folded in my jacket pocket, not because I needed reassurance anymore, but because I wanted to see the land clearly on my own terms. The ridge trail beyond the property still existed, the trees were still there, and the air still carried that cold, clean smell that had made me want the place in the first place. The difference was that nobody got to tell me I was a guest in my own life. Looking back, the strangest part is how close they came to making the whole thing sound normal. If I had been less prepared, less stubborn, or simply more tired, I can see how easy it would have been to back away and call it bad luck. But that is exactly how people like Diane win. They make overreach feel routine, and they count on exhaustion to finish the job. In the end, I did get the peaceful cabin I bought. I just had to prove, with documents and patience and more restraint than I knew I had, that peace means nothing if it depends on surrendering what is already yours.